The new Reverend father disguised as a beggar to test his church. The result was shocking. Nobody stopped, nobody knelt down, nobody knew. The man on the pavement outside St. Monica Catholic Church, the one in the mud-coloured coat with missing buttons, the one who smelled of 3 days of rain, the one the ushers were already moving to remove, was their new priest. And in 2 hours, he was going to stand at that altar and show them exactly what they had done. That is where this story begins. It was the most anticipated Sunday St. Monica had seen in years. Weeks of excited whispers, framed announcements in the parish hall, a congregation dressed like they were meeting royalty because in their minds they were. Everyone had heard about Father John Paul, tall, handsome, educated in Rome. A man with a voice like a cathedral bell and the kind of presence that makes a room go quiet without effort. They had no idea he was already there. Sitting on the cold pavement outside their polished brass gate, coat torn, shoes cracked, watching every single one of them walk past. What happened next inside that church? What was said? What was done? And what one elderly woman did that nobody else had the courage to do, would leave an entire congregation on their knees before the morning was over. Stay with us, this is the story of Father John Paul, and it will stay with you long after it ends. If this kind of story speaks to you, please like and subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Manchester, London, Atlanta, Toronto, we want to know. Now let us begin. He had been standing at that gate for 40 minutes. 40 minutes of watching St. Monica wake up, the flower arrangers arriving with their lilies, the choir filing in through the side entrance still humming scales, the ushers taking their positions with the practiced solemnity of palace guards. 40 minutes of being looked through, stepped around, and quietly erased from the morning, the way an unpleasant thought is pushed down before prayer. He had chosen his spot deliberately, not hidden, not tucked into a corner where invisibility would be easy to explain. He sat directly beside the main gate in plain view of every person who entered, his plastic bag between his feet, his borrowed coat smelling of the rain he had stood in since 5 in the morning. Anyone who wanted to see him could see him. That was the point. What he saw in return told him everything. A man in a charcoal suit came through first, walking with the confidence of someone whose name was on a church building. He looked at John Paul the way you look at a crack in an otherwise perfect wall, registering it, deciding it was someone else's problem, moving on. Then a young mother with 2 small boys. The older one, curious, actually slowed down and turned his head. She caught it immediately. Without a word, without even looking at John Paul herself, she placed one hand firmly on her son's shoulder and steered him to the other side of the walkway. The boy looked back once. She did not. Then a cluster of women in matching purple head wraps, laughing about something warm and private between them. One of them glanced his way, and the laughter softened, not from pity, but from the mild discomfort of something unsightly interrupting a beautiful morning. John Paul did not move, he did not speak, he simply watched. He had heard them over the past 3 weeks in the parish newsletter, in the diocesan bulletin, in the breathless chatter that preceded every new assignment. Have you seen his photo? Tall, very handsome, educated in Rome. They say he speaks 4 languages. They say when he celebrates Mass you feel it. He knew exactly what they were expecting to walk through those gates today. He knew the image they had been polishing in their minds like silverware before a feast. And he knew that the man they were ignoring, the one they were quietly, politely, thoroughly pretending did not exist, was that same person. That was not what broke his heart. What broke his heart was how easy it was for them. There was no cruelty on their faces, no contempt. Only the calm, well-practiced indifference of people who had learned, over many comfortable years, that certain kinds of suffering were simply not their responsibility to see. He reached into his coat pocket and closed his fingers around a small, smooth peppermint he hadn't put there himself. Someone had slipped it into his hand earlier, an old woman, the only one who had stopped. He held it like a compass and waited. He decided it was time to go inside. The morning sun had climbed high enough to make the stained glass above the entrance burn with colour, deep blues and burning golds, a mosaic of the Annunciation that the parish brochure described as one of the finest in the diocese. John Paul looked up at it as he crossed the threshold, at the angel's open hands, at the light pouring through Mary's bowed head, and he felt the familiar pull of the sacred beneath all the gilding. Then the doors closed behind him, and he felt something else entirely. The interior of St. Monica was immaculate. Polished mahogany pews stretched in long, even rows toward the altar, each one buffed to a warm gleam. White lilies stood at measured intervals along the aisle. The air smelled of candle wax and something expensive, a diffuser perhaps, or the collective fragrance of a congregation that had never once worried about the cost of things. Soft organ music pressed gently against the high ceiling. Everything about the space said order. Everything about it said, "We have earned this." John Paul moved quietly down the center aisle toward the front. He chose the third pew, close enough to the altar to matter, visible enough that anyone paying attention would have to decide, consciously and deliberately, what to do with him. He stepped in, settled onto the polished wood, and folded his hands in his lap. He had barely been seated 30 seconds. "Excuse me." The voice came from his left, measured, not unkind, carrying the particular tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without needing to raise their pitch. The man was heavy-set, silver-haired, wearing a tie pin that caught the light. He held a printed seating card between two fingers like a small verdict. "This section is reserved, building committee and their families." He gestured vaguely toward the back with the card. "You'll find open seating further down." John Paul looked at him for a moment, then he nodded, rose, and moved. He tried the fifth pew. A woman in a cream blazer placed her handbag on the space beside her before he could sit, not looking up from her missal, her gesture carrying the fluency of long habit. He moved again. The seventh pew held a family spread wide enough to suggest that every inch was occupied by someone important, though 3 of the spaces were clearly empty. A man at the end of the row simply stretched his arm across the back of the bench and looked forward. John Paul kept walking. By the time he reached the second to last pew, the one near the pillar where the sightline to the altar was partially blocked, and the sound from the choir grew thin, no one stopped him. No one needed to. He had already learned his place without a single person having to say it directly. He sat down in the shadows and looked toward the altar, a long way off now, framed in gold he could barely see. The organ announced the Gloria like a king entering a throne room. It rose from the front pipes in a wave that filled every corner of St. Monica, climbing the stone walls, pressing against the vaulted ceiling, rolling back down over the congregation in something that, if you closed your eyes, felt genuinely close to glory. The choir answered it with 40 trained voices, precise and powerful, the sopranos lifting the melody into a register that made the air itself seem to thin. It was, by any honest measure, magnificent. Gloria in excelsis Deo, glory to God in the highest. John Paul closed his eyes for just a moment and let it land on him. Even now, even here, even in this coat that smelled of wet pavement and someone else's discarded life, the music reached something in him that had nothing to do with the morning's experiment. He was still a priest. He still loved this. That was perhaps the most complicated thing he carried, the fact that the beauty was real, even when the people performing it were not yet who they believed themselves to be. He opened his eyes. The woman 2 rows ahead had turned to look at him twice already. Not the slow, sympathetic glance of someone concerned, the sharp, sideways look of someone calculating whether his presence constituted a problem requiring action. Her husband leaned toward her briefly and she straightened, returning her eyes to her hymnal, but her shoulders remained lifted, tense, aware. The man directly in front of John Paul had shifted to the far end of his pew, creating a careful distance that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with message. An usher stationed near the back pillar had not taken his eyes off him since he sat down. Not with hostility exactly, with the vigilant, proprietary attention of someone guarding an investment. And through all of it the choir sang on. Et in terra pax hominibus boni voluntatis, and on earth peace to people of good will. John Paul watched a man in the 5th row lift both hands slightly during the refrain, eyes closed, face tilted upward in the private theatre of personal devotion. It was a sincere gesture. He did not doubt that. The man felt something real in this moment. And yet 20 minutes earlier, that same man had pulled his son away from the gate as though proximity to suffering were a communicable disease. That was the thing that sat heaviest in John Paul's chest, not the hardness, but the distance between what people felt in song and what they practiced in the space between songs. The Gloria was not a lie, but it was, this morning, deeply incomplete. The voices swelled toward the final phrase, triumphant and full. In the last pew, half hidden by a stone pillar, the man they were all about to meet folded his hands and said the words quietly to himself, alone, and meant every single one. She came from the side aisle, moving slowly. Age had shortened her, curved her slightly forward at the shoulders, and given her walk the careful, unhurried quality of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the world would not wait for her. She wore a plain navy dress and a small hat with a fabric flower pinned above the brim, the kind of hat that had been worn to church every Sunday for 20 years and was no less dignified for it. She carried a worn Bible pressed against her chest, a hymnal tucked under one arm, and a handbag that had seen better decades but was spotlessly clean. The ushers did not move to assist her. They were occupied, as they had been all morning, with the important business of managing the important people. She made her way to the last pew without help, without complaint, and without appearing to notice either. Then she looked at John Paul, and she did something no one else in St. Monica had done all morning. She smiled at him first. Not the cautious, pitying smile of someone performing charity. Not the brief, uncomfortable smile of someone who felt they ought to acknowledge him before looking away. It was a full, unhurried smile, the kind that lives in the eyes as much as the mouth, the kind that said "I see you" without making a theatre of the seeing. "Is this space taken?" she asked, as though he were the one doing her a favour. He shook his head. She settled in beside him with a small sigh of relief, the way people do when they have finally arrived somewhere they intended to be. Without a word, she opened her hymnal to the correct page. They were mid-service, the page number long since announced and forgotten, and tilted it toward him so they could share it. Her finger rested gently at the start of the verse, a quiet guide, asking nothing in return. John Paul looked down at the page. His throat tightened in a way he had not anticipated. A few minutes later, during the quiet before the reading, she reached into her handbag with the focused patience of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. She produced a single peppermint, the soft, old-fashioned kind wrapped in clear plastic, and placed it on the pew between them without ceremony, the way you offer something to a person you have simply decided to be kind to. She did not check his reaction. She did not wait for gratitude. She had already turned back to her Bible, her lips moving slightly with the text, her small hat perfectly still. John Paul picked up the peppermint and held it in his palm. Around them, 40 voices were singing about mercy. But in the last pew of St. Monica Catholic Church, pressed against a stone pillar that blocked the view of the altar, mercy was not being sung about. It was just sitting quietly, in a navy dress, sharing her hymnal. The first Mass ended the way it always did, the organ offering a recessional, the congregation rising in a single, practiced motion, conversations resuming before the priest had fully cleared the sanctuary. Within minutes, the nave had exhaled its formality and transformed into something more familiar, a social gathering that happened to be held in a sacred building. Tables had been arranged in the side hall adjacent to the main church, a long, carefully dressed spread of pastries, fruit, small sandwiches cut into triangles, and a large silver urn of coffee that gleamed like a liturgical vessel. Parishioners moved toward it with the easy confidence of people in a space that belonged to them, voices rising, laughter loosening. The morning's worship settling comfortably into the background of the more immediate business of being seen. John Paul waited until the initial rush had thinned before he approached. He was not asking for much. He had been outside in the early morning cold for 3 hours before Mass, and then seated in a stone-walled corner of the church for another hour. He wanted water. Simply that, a glass of water, the most basic thing one human being can offer another. He reached the edge of the refreshment table and stood quietly. A woman arranging cups noticed him and paused, her hand suspended over the stack. Her eyes moved across him once, taking inventory, the coat, the shoes, the plastic bag he still carried, and then she turned and said something quietly to the man standing behind her, a broad-shouldered figure in a well-fitted blazer with a laminated council badge clipped to his lapel. The man turned. He had the face of someone accustomed to making decisions and moving on from them quickly. He looked at John Paul with neither anger nor apology, only the brisk, resolute expression of someone solving a logistical problem. "This gathering is for registered parish members," he said, keeping his voice low enough to be discreet, firm enough to be final. "There's a shelter on Clement Road about 3 miles from here. They'll be able to help you." He paused, then added the part that landed heaviest. "We're expecting a representative from the bishop's office this morning, so we do need the space kept clear." John Paul held his gaze for a moment, just a moment. Then he nodded, the same quiet nod he had given the man with the seating card, and he stepped back from the table without a word. He walked back through the side door into the church, which was now nearly empty, the candles still burning at the altar, the lilies still standing at attention, the gold still catching the light with beautiful indifference. He sat in the last pew again and reached into his coat pocket. The peppermint was still there. He thought about Mrs. Gable, who had nothing worth displaying, and had given it anyway. Then he thought about what he was going to say in 2 hours, when he stood at that altar and opened his mouth for the very first time as their priest. He already knew every word. He used the back entrance, the one behind the rectory garden that the groundskeeper left unlocked on Sunday mornings for the altar servers. No one saw him go in. The sacristy was a long, narrow room that smelled of candle wax, cedar, and the particular quiet that accumulates in spaces where sacred things are prepared. Vestment cases lined one wall. A large mirror in a dark wooden frame stood at the far end, positioned so that a priest could make a final check before processing to the altar. A single high window let in a column of late morning light that fell across the tiled floor in a clean, pale rectangle. John Paul set his plastic bag down by the door and stood still for a moment. He peeled off the oversized coat slowly, the way you remove something that has taught you something, carefully, with attention. He folded it once and laid it across the wooden bench beside the vestment case. Then he sat down and removed the cracked shoes, placing them together with a neatness that felt in that moment like a small act of respect for the morning they had carried him through. He stood at the basin and ran the water until it was warm. He washed his hands twice. The garden soil he had pressed under his fingernails before dawn came away gradually, the water darkening and then clearing. He watched it go. He dried his hands on the clean white towel hanging beside the basin and stood for a moment looking at them, the same hands, clean now, that people had avoided all morning without knowing what they held. He opened the vestment case. The alb was pressed and white, the kind of white that has intention behind it. He drew it over his head in one motion, and something in the set of his shoulders changed as the fabric settled. Not a performance, not a costume change, but a man returning to the truest version of himself after a long time away. He fastened the cincture at his waist, lifted the stole and kissed its center before placing it across his shoulders, then drew the chasuble over everything, its deep green fabric falling in clean, heavy folds. He turned to the mirror. The man looking back at him was tall, broad-shouldered. His jaw was strong, his eyes steady, his bearing the kind that fills a room without effort. This was the man in the framed photograph in the parish hall. This was the man they had dressed up for. He reached into the pocket of the folded coat on the bench and took out the peppermint. He held it for a long moment, looking at his own reflection, the gold vestments, the polished collar, the face they had been waiting weeks to see. And then he placed the small, worn sweet carefully into the pocket of his chasuble, close to his chest. Then he bowed his head, closed his eyes and prayed. Not for words, he already had those. He prayed for the courage to deliver them with love rather than judgment, because what was coming would cut deep enough without any help from anger. By 11 o'clock, St. Monica was full. Not the polite, orderly fullness of the early morning mass, but the charged, expectant fullness of an occasion. Every pew occupied, the side chairs brought out and arranged along the walls, children settled with unusual obedience beside parents who had impressed upon them more than once the importance of today. The flower arrangements had been refreshed. The candles at the altar were new, their flames straight and unwavering. Someone had placed an additional arrangement of white lilies at the foot of the ambo, and the combined fragrance of flowers and incense and expensive perfume created something that was almost overwhelming in its deliberateness. They had prepared for arrival. The bishop's representative, a composed man in a dark suit, sat in the reserved section near the front, a leather portfolio on his knee, his expression professionally neutral. Around him, the building committee, the council members, the heads of parish ministries, the largest donors, the families whose surnames appeared on the memorial plaques bolted to the walls, all of them arranged in their rightful places, dressed in the full weight of their belonging. Near the back, in the last pew beside the pillar, Mrs. Gable sat with her worn Bible and her navy hat, hands folded, waiting with the patient stillness of someone who had long since stopped needing occasions to feel at home in God's house. The organ began. It opened quietly this time, not the triumphant blast of the Gloria but something measured and ascending, building with the slow deliberateness of a tide coming in. The congregation straightened almost as one. Heads turned toward the rear doors. A woman near the middle reached out and touched her husband's arm. Somewhere behind John Paul's pillar, someone whispered, "Here he comes." The procession emerged from the side entrance. The altar servers came first, 2 boys in white carrying candles, their faces set with the concentration of children entrusted with something important. Then the deacon, then the reader, each step measured, the procession moving with the deep, unhurried rhythm of the liturgy. The organ climbed another register. The congregation leaned forward collectively, necks craning, that particular human instinct toward the thing they had been anticipating. And then Father John Paul appeared. Tall, broad-shouldered, the green chasuble falling in clean, deliberate folds. His face composed, his bearing exactly what the photograph in the parish hall had promised, the kind of presence that does not announce itself because it does not need to. A quiet murmur moved through the congregation like wind across water, the collective exhale of people whose expectations had been met. He processed down the center aisle with his eyes forward, his hands folded before him, his face carrying an expression that the congregation read as solemnity and reverence. Only Mrs. Gable, watching from the last pew as he passed, noticed something else in it entirely. She recognized the weight a man carries when he already knows what he is about to say, and knows that nothing in the room will be the same once he has said it. She opened her Bible to no page in particular, and held it to her chest like armor. The Mass moved through its rhythms with precision and beauty. Readings were delivered clearly, the psalm was sung with feeling, the creed was recited by a congregation that knew every word by heart. From the ambo, Father John Paul had presided over it all with the quiet authority of a man entirely at home in the liturgy, responding, gesturing, moving through the ancient choreography with a naturalness that confirmed everything the parish had hoped for. The bishop's representative made a small note in his portfolio. The building committee exchanged satisfied glances. The morning, after all, was going exactly as planned. Then came the homily. John Paul stepped up to the pulpit and gripped the sides lightly with both hands. He looked out across the congregation, all those expectant faces, all that careful dressing, all that pride arranged in polished rows, and he said nothing. 10 seconds passed, then 15. The silence was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has mass and pressure, the kind that makes people shift in their seats and wonder whether something has gone wrong. A child coughed near the middle. Someone's program rustled. The bishop's representative looked up from his portfolio. John Paul reached into the pocket of his chasuble. He placed the peppermint on the edge of the pulpit, small, slightly worn at the wrapper's crease, unremarkable in every way, and rested his finger beside it. Then he looked up. "Someone gave me this morning," he said. His voice was calm and clear, carrying to the back without effort. "I want to tell you where I was when I received it." He began quietly. No dramatics, no pulpit thunder, just the steady, unhurried voice of a man recounting something true. He described the gate, the coat, the rain, the 3 hours on the pavement before the first Mass while St. Monica was arranging its lilies and preparing its coffee. He described the center aisle and the man with the seating card. He described the handbag placed across the empty space. He described the pew that became a wall that became a shadow in the corner by the pillar. He picked up the peppermint. "And I was told," he said, his voice still level, "that there is a shelter on Clement Road 3 miles away, that this gathering was for registered parish members." He paused, that the space needed to be kept clear before the bishop's representative arrived. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. He looked at the council member who had said it, not with accusation, with something more difficult to bear than accusation, with the steady, sorrowful gaze of a father who had hoped for better and was not surprised to find less, and loved them anyway. "One person," he said, "gave me something this morning. One person looked at a dirty stranger and saw someone worth a smile, a shared page, and a peppermint." He set it back down gently. "I need you to understand that she was the only one in this building today who behaved as though she believed what we just spent an hour singing." He let that land. Then softly, "My name is Father John Paul, and I'm very glad to finally meet you." For a long moment nobody moved. The congregation sat in the particular stillness of people who have just heard something they cannot unknow, not the stillness of peace, but the stunned, airless quiet of a room where a mirror has been held up without warning, and everyone is seeing their own reflection for the first time. The lilies stood at attention. The candles burned straight and indifferent. The bishop's representative had closed his portfolio. Then, from the third pew, a sound. It was small at first, the kind of sound a person tries to suppress and cannot. One of the ushers, the broad-shouldered one who had stood guard at the back pillar all morning, had his face in his hands. His shoulders moved once, then again. The man beside him, the one with the seating card, the silver tie pin catching the altar light, was staring at the floor with the fixed, hollow expression of someone dismantling something they had spent years constructing. The first usher stood up. He moved out of his pew and walked toward the altar with no clear intention other than forward, the way people move when the weight of something becomes too large to carry sitting down. He stopped at the altar rail and knelt, and the sound he made was not performance and not theatre. It was the sound of something breaking open that had needed to break for a long time. He was not alone for long. They came in ones and twos, then in a quiet, steady stream, the woman with the cream blazer, her missal still in her hand. The man who had stretched his arm across the pew. 2 members of the building committee, still wearing their lanyards. The council member who had mentioned the shelter on Clement Road stood at the end of his row for a long moment before he walked forward, and when he knelt he did not look composed or important or administrative. He looked, for the first time that morning, entirely human. John Paul came down from the pulpit and moved among them. He did not offer speeches or summaries. He placed his hand on a shoulder here, bowed his head beside someone there, listened to words too quiet for anyone else to hear. He was not performing forgiveness. He was simply present with people in the middle of their reckoning, which is the oldest priestly work there is. At the back of the church, Mrs. Gable had not moved from her pew. She was watching everything with her hands folded over her Bible, her small hat perfectly still, her eyes bright and calm, the expression of someone who had always known what was possible in people and had simply been waiting for it to surface. After the final blessing, someone propped both main doors of St. Monica open wide. It was a small thing, a practical thing. Perhaps the hall was warm, the morning air was clean. But the doors stayed open through the social hour and through the clearing up, and when the last parishioner finally left, they were still open, framing a rectangle of light that fell across the marble steps and reached all the way to the street. Where anyone could see it. Where anyone could follow it in.